Imagine a world where the legendary Windows you grew up with, the blue start button, the familiarity of Explorer, the desktop that millions use every day, slowly fades from being the native operating system on your PC, your laptop, and even your developer machine. Imagine that instead of being the core of your personal computing experience, Windows becomes a thin veneer over something more powerful, something more flexible, something Linux. This is not speculation from some fringe tech blog. This idea, this whispered evolution, is now being discussed in earnest across YouTube channels, developer forums, and tech circles, and it centers around a technology Microsoft has been quietly nurturing for years. What if Microsoft's new Linux mode, whatever form it ultimately takes, doesn't just make Windows better for developers, but actually begins a slow shift that could kill Windows as we know it? That's a dramatic claim, but to understand why it's being made, we have to start with history, context, and where Microsoft is putting its strategic weight. To understand what people mean when they talk about a Linux mode in Windows, we have to go back to 2016, when Microsoft introduced something called the Windows Subsystem for Linux, or WSL, was originally a way for developers to run a Linux command line environment directly inside Windows, without needing a separate virtual machine or dual boot setup. At a time when Linux was still something separate from Windows, this was already big news. It allowed developers to run their favorite Linux tools, shells, and environments from right inside the Windows world, something that had been alien and frustrating for years. Historically, if a Windows user wanted Linux tools, they used things like Cygwin, or a virtual machine, or a separate Linux partition. WSL changed that. Over time, Microsoft improved WSL as a full integration layer, and then made it even more powerful with WSL2, which actually includes a real Linux kernel running inside a lightweight virtual machine. This provided near-native compatibility with Linux applications and dramatically expanded what was possible on Windows in a Linux environment. Unlike traditional virtualization, WSL is tightly integrated. It shares files, integrates network and display support, and blurs the lines between the two worlds. For years, WSL was a developer tool. It was something that coders, system administrators, DevOps engineers, and Linux enthusiasts would cheer about because it made their workflow easier. But over time, WSL grew beyond a niche feature. In May 2025, Microsoft made a landmark announcement at its Build Developer Conference. The Windows subsystem for Linux is now open source. Nearly the entire codebase, the layer that enables Linux code to run inside Windows, was published on GitHub, inviting developers from all over the world to inspect it, modify it, and contribute to its evolution. Microsoft explicitly said that this was a key step in making Linux integration better and faster, and closing a nearly decade-long community request to open source the project. Open sourcing WSL has deep implications that go beyond transparency. It connects Microsoft's Windows ecosystem to the heart of the open-source Linux world. It aligns the development paths of Windows and Linux tooling. It invites contributions from the very community that often criticizes Windows. And it blurs the lines between where Windows ends and Linux begins. This is the seed of what some are calling Linux mode. But what exactly does this term mean? When tech commentators talk about Linux mode, they're referring to a future where Windows machines could, technically and functionally, run Linux as a core operating environment, or where the Linux runtime could become the default host for applications with the classic Windows interface layered on top. This isn't Microsoft publicly saying Windows is dead. Instead, it's a conceptual narrative emerging from the combination of open sourcing WSL, deeper Linux integration, and broader trends in how computing infrastructure is evolving. It's the idea that Microsoft is finally embracing Linux, not just as a compatibility tool, but as an elemental backbone of its modern computing strategy. The reason this is intriguing and threatening to some people is that it flips the historical narrative. For decades, Windows and Linux were competitors. Windows dominated personal computing. Linux dominated servers, cloud infrastructure, and embedded environments. They lived in different worlds. Linux was often the domain of experts. Windows was the domain of mainstream users. But over the last decade, that boundary has eroded. Linux now powers Android phones used by billions. Linux runs virtually every major cloud workload in the world. Linux is everywhere. Microsoft's open sourcing of WSL acknowledges this reality. Linux is indispensable, ubiquitous, and strategically critical. So when someone frames this as the biggest OS shift in tech history, or suggests a new Linux mode might kill Windows forever, what do they really mean? They're not usually saying Windows will literally vanish tomorrow. They're saying the central role Windows plays as a standalone operating system platform could be fundamentally altered. They're saying that the OS wars, the old battles over who controls the desktop, might no longer matter because computing has shifted to environments where multiple OS layers coexist, where virtualization and containers are the norm, and where Linux often underlies everything. In this future, Windows might not compete as an independent kernel or core system. It might leverage Linux as its foundation in many scenarios. Consider how developers now think about environments. With WSL, a developer can open up a Linux terminal on their Windows laptop and run tools like grep, SSH, Git, Python, Ruby, or Docker containers, all with native Linux behavior. This reduces the cognitive load of switching environments and makes Windows a more attractive platform for cross-platform development. But as that integration deepens, some developers start thinking differently about their choice of primary OS. If Linux tools are this accessible inside Windows, why not go all the way? That question is what gives weight to the idea of Windows losing its centrality. In the broader tech landscape, we're also seeing movements that challenge the dominance of Windows. Enthusiasts of Linux distributions like Zorin OS, Ubuntu, Fedora, and others are actively seeking alternatives to Windows, especially as older versions of Windows reach end of life. As mainstream Windows versions like Windows 10 have officially stopped receiving security updates, and users face forced upgrades to newer Windows versions that they may not like, more users are evaluating Linux as a viable alternative. Some community movements, like the End of 10 Inches campaign, actively encourage users with unsupported machines to shift to Linux rather than buy new Windows machines. The gaming world, traditionally one of Windows' strongest footholds, also reflects this shift. Linux-based gaming platforms like Valve's SteamOS have been gaining traction among gamers, and reports suggest that some players are migrating from Windows 11 to SteamOS, not because they reject Windows outright, but because the Linux gaming experience is maturing and becoming more appealing. All of this leaves us with a thought experiment. What if Windows eventually embraced Linux not as a subsystem, but as the core execution environment? What if Microsoft creates an official Linux-first Windows distribution where the Linux kernel handles system calls, drivers, hardware interactions, and foundational processes, and Windows becomes the graphical shell on top of that? That's what the idea of Linux mode represents in some of the more speculative narratives. In this scenario, Windows, as a distinct platform with its own NT kernel, might be replaced by a system where Linux does most of the heavy lifting. Some commentators have even made videos titled, "Why Microsoft's New Linux Mode Could Finally Kill Windows for Good," to explore this possibility. Now, before we get carried away, it's important to note that Microsoft itself has never publicly announced that it plans to replace the Windows kernel with Linux. To date, Windows still uses its own NT kernel, and major parts of Windows are proprietary. Analysis from respected sources cautions against assuming Microsoft will entirely abandon the NT codebase or make Windows open source. There remain components of WSL that rely on proprietary drivers, and the broader Windows ecosystem is still tightly dependent on Microsoft's internal development model. But that doesn't mean the direction of evolution isn't significant. Open sourcing WSL and inviting community contributions is a sign that Microsoft recognizes where momentum lies. It acknowledges that Linux is not just a niche competitor. It's a foundational technology that is reshaping how computing systems are built. It also hints at a future where the line between Windows and Linux is increasingly a semantic distinction, not a technical one. To understand the broader implication of this shift, consider the macro trend in operating systems: containers, virtualization, cloud infrastructure, and distributed workloads. In most modern computing environments, from servers to edge devices, Linux is the standard. Developers write code assuming Linux behavior, testing on Linux environments, deploying on Linux workloads. The idea that a traditional desktop OS like Windows would maintain a separate identity in such a world grows less tenable over time. So what would a Linux-centric Windows world look like? For consumers, it might be seamless. You'd boot up your PC, log in, and see the familiar Windows interface. But under the hood, many core services might be handled by a Linux kernel and Linux tooling. Applications, whether Windows apps or Linux apps, could run side by side. Instead of Windows being replaced overnight, it would be reimagined, a Windows user experience running on a Linux foundation. For developers, this could eliminate many friction points that currently exist in cross-platform development. The days of juggling separate virtual machines, dual boots, or remote Linux servers could be replaced by a more unified development stack. For enterprises, it could mean more standardization, lower licensing costs, and greater flexibility. For open-source advocates, it could represent a long-awaited convergence of worlds that previously felt separate. None of this is certain or imminent. There are substantial challenges: compatibility, legacy software that depends on NT kernel behavior, security models, driver support, and the massive ecosystem of Windows applications that assume a Windows kernel underneath. Microsoft would have to balance all of this while managing decades-old investments from corporations and consumers that depend on Windows as we know it. Still, the narrative of a big OS shift isn't just about technology, it's about perception, intention, and direction. It's about how developers and users think about platforms. It's about whether Windows remains a monolithic, proprietary ecosystem, or evolves into a hybrid world where Linux powers the core and Windows shapes the user experience on top. In the end, the idea that a new Linux mode could kill Windows forever is less a prophecy and more a reflection of how computing is changing. It's a way of framing the dramatic shift from isolated proprietary platforms toward open, collaborative, interoperable systems where users and developers have more choice and flexibility. Whether Windows will literally disappear or simply adapt and transform is uncertain. But one thing is clear: the operating systems of the future will look very different from those of the past, and Linux, in whatever form, will be a central part of that transformation.